This paper is going to briefly outline the contemporary Christian and Muslim landscape in Syria and consider the importance that Eastern Christian thought can make to the interreligious context within Syria and the wider region. The paper concludes, it's based, the work, the paper is based on very much edited sections of this book, which explores this in much greater depth, that was published, as has been mentioned, in November last year, which is the result of substantial research inside Syria. The paper concludes that the significance of the theology and spirituality of the Untitled paradigm of Eastern Christianity has been under-recognized in Western discourse, and that having coexisted within the cultural environment of Islam, it is uniquely placed to play a major role in Christian-Muslim dialogue and the reframing of Islam's engagement with modern society. As well as leading several groups to visit Syria before the conflict, my research has taken me to Syria 10 times since the conflict began in 2011, traveling across Syria and meeting hundreds of ordinary Syrians, as well as faith, community, and political leaders in areas most affected by the conflict. For practical and safety reasons, the research has been undertaken within government-held areas and areas recently returned to government control. This is important, given that the social and religious context within these areas, where at least 70% of the population live, has been severely underrepresented within Western academic, religious, political, and media discourse. My doctoral research on the contemporary and historic religious dynamics in Syria, as I said, was published in November last year. So what is the Christian landscape? I'm going to look at the Christian landscape and then the Muslim landscape, and very briefly, and then look at the Eastern Christian contribution. Christianity is deeply embedded within the religious and cultural identity of Syria. Yet although Eastern Christianity constitutes one of the largest traditions in the world, Christian traditions, it has been significantly understudied until recent years. Prior to the Islamic conquest, there was a diverse Christian presence across the Arabian Peninsula, which evolved to include all 5 families of the Christian church. Today, Damascus is home to the 3 Antiochian patriarchates of the Eastern Antiochian Orthodox, the Syriac Orthodox, and the Melkite Catholic churches. And all their incumbent denominations are nearly all present in Syria. This plurality is part of a feature of Syrian society. Whilst the initial Muslim invasions were often brutal, Christians adopted the Arabic language during the 8th to 9th centuries and became vital conduits of Greek philosophy and theological dialogue, playing an important administrative role in the courts of the caliphs. The violence in the Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries caused lasting tensions for Eastern Christians with their fellow Muslim citizens, but it was also a time of encounter between Western and Eastern Christendom and Islam. Under Ottoman rule, the millet system allowed non-Muslim communities a degree of administrative autonomy. However, demi-status imposed a second-class citizenship. The freedoms given to non-Muslims during the Tanzimat reforms of the 1850s and the advantages that these offered Christian communities through strengthening trade opportunities with Europe caused tension and violence between Christians and Muslims that exploded into serious riots in Lebanon and Syria in 1850 and 1860. The principles of administrative autonomy that were there present in the millet system continue to be reflected in religious structures today, and these traditions continue to be an important aspect of the role of religious leadership in the Levantine countries today, and I'll come back to that. Religious leadership is very, very important in the region. The Catholic family of churches were established in the 18th century, and Protestants arrived in the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, all 5 families of the Christian church, the Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, and Assyrian Church of the East are present in Syria. The Eastern North Oriental Orthodox churches have always found the presence of Western Christianity challenging, and this has often been a source of disunity and division. But ecumenical relations have much improved in recent years as the churches have faced together the challenges of conflict and religious extremism, challenges that have also led to a re-examination by Eastern Christians of their role and their identity in the region, and I'll come back to that. Since the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Christian population in Greater Syria has reduced from about 30% of the population to less than 5%. Conflicts and emigration have all played a role in this decline. The genocide in Turkey, events in Israel, Palestine, the rise of militant Islamism, the consequences of recent regional conflicts have all had a devastating impact on the Christian presence. And fear of the militant Islamism that has characterized most of the external opposition in the Syrian conflict have caused many Syrians to continue to support the Syrian government during the recent conflict. As Razak Syriani states, a Syrian Christian who now lives in Canada, no wonder Christians in Syria felt threatened and unprotected when the uprising started in March 2011 and when it later took on a militant aspect. Christian communities felt that the rise of militant Islam against the ruling regime and its initial success would threaten their very presence of protection. This led to a mass exodus of Christians, particularly intellectuals and young people, from Syria. The reason for the large-scale emigration is that many Christians fear that a society marked by tolerance, safety, plurality, and coexistence will be replaced by one that is exclusive, monolithic, and fanatically Islamic. Such fears are not exclusive to Christians. Many Muslims have opted to leave the country for similar reasons, and many Muslims echo that fear today in dialogue as well. Yet many Christians, despite the atrocities and difficulties of life in a war situation, have to remain in the country or have left only as a last resort. Yet for centuries, Syria has been a place of refuge as well, for Armenians and Syriacs, for Iraqis and Palestinians. The country has played an important role in the renaissance of Eastern Christianity. And during the recent conflict, religious leaders have played a key role in peace-building initiatives and have worked hard to encourage and restore trust within society and provided significant, indeed remarkable levels of humanitarian support to local communities. That's really underestimated. The work of the churches, all the churches, in supporting their communities of all communal groups is quite phenomenal in Syria, but there's little recognized and little heard about. The Muslim landscape in Syria is also far from uniform in political, social, or religious expression. Thomas Pierre in Edinburgh writes, "There is no such thing as a unified religious scene. The pre-war figure of 87% of the population as Muslim includes all Muslim communities, including the Kurds, who are about 10%, Shia sects, including Alawites, Ismaili, and Druze, and so hides the plurality of Islamic expression in Syria. There's long been resentment among some Sunnis that the Alawite minority, a Shia group, have held power for over 40 years and promoted secular modernity. The Ba'ath Party under both Bashar and his father Hafez al-Assad has included representation from all communities within parliament and the army leadership and has encouraged religious freedom. For this reason, many Syrians are opposed to political Islamism and support Arab nationalism. The tension between these two paradigms has been considerable in Middle Eastern politics in recent decades. It's not just a Syrian thing. Militant Islamism and Arab nationalism is a major paradigm that is being confronted in recent decades. Islam in Syria has been deeply impacted by the Islamic reform movements and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was, of course, bitterly opposed to the secular nationalist movements in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Dividing into political and militant wings, which committed multiple acts of violence, the Muslim Brotherhood was brutally crushed and outlawed in Syria in the 1980s, but its exiled leaders continued to wield significant influence in supporting the militant opposition and Western allies in the Syrian conflict. Nevertheless, a critic of the Syrian government and former member of parliament, Mohammed al-Habash, admitted almost all Syrians are moderates and centrists. They do not support the war and destruction, but instead seek reconciliation and coexistence. Prior to the conflict, the polarization of Sunni and Shia, the strengthening of Sharia law and conservative Sunni ideology, the secular constitution of the country, the rise of minority communities, the presence of large numbers of refugees from Iraq and Palestine, the impact of post-9/11 wars launched by the United States and its allies, and a decentralized authority within Sunni Islam, all had an effect on how the Islamic landscape was evolving in Syria. There have been multiple ways of interreligious engagement in Syria for centuries, and faith leaders have acted as a bridge between their communities and the political leadership. Although trust within society at large has been damaged by war, religious leaders have sought to model good relations and have played an important role in local ceasefire and reconciliation arrangements throughout Syria. Despite Western skepticism about such initiatives, dozens of religious leaders and thousands of local volunteers have been involved in these processes, and fighting has been successfully ended in many towns and villages and cities throughout Syria. Malula is one of the most important Christian villages in the Levant. In 2013, the village was attacked by hundreds of rebel fighters. A village leader stressed, "We must emphasize that the so-called Free Syria Army were major partners in all of these. There was no distinguishing between the moderate groups and the extremist factions." On 7th of September 2013, the militants murdered 3 male members of a family after they refused to convert. Over the following months, churches were desecrated, houses gutted, and farmlands destroyed. A villager said, "We spent hundreds of years living together without a problem. It was only after residents of the village went to live and work in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and returned with sectarian tendencies that tensions developed." The Christian village of Sadnaya, whose convents pictured above or left there, has been a place of pilgrimage for Christians and Muslims since the 7th century, was besieged in 2013 by militants for 6 months. When the town was close to capture, Christian and Muslim residents joined the Syrian army in defending the town, whilst the remainder went into the churches to pray for safety. When I visited Sadnaya in 2017, the Mother Superior said to me, "When you return to England, tell them to come to Sadnaya and to thank the Christians and Muslims of this town for saving this monastery and for saving Christianity in this land from the terrorists that your government is supporting." Across Syria, Christians and Muslims fought side by side against militant jihadists to protect their communities. In 2017, Chaldean Bishop of Aleppo, Antoine Aldo, wrote, "At the start of the conflict, militants tried to pit Muslims against Christians, but they failed. Our country has a rich culture and history to which Syrians are loyal, regardless of religion. Syria is more than one man. This is not well understood in the West. It is important that we continue to represent Arab Christianity to show the Muslim and Arab world that there are Christians with whom they can have a dialogue." The Salafist tendencies and extreme ideologies held by most of the militants have been well documented even by their supporters, and there are plenty of references to that. But whilst sectarian dynamics have been used to intensify division, most Syrians say the primary drivers of the conflict were political and economic. They have witnessed brutal sectarian violence committed by Islamist groups against any opposed to their ideology. However much Islamists claim to consider the interests of all Syrians, there has been no evidence of this in the conflict. Healing and the rebuilding of trust between communities will take a long time. As stated in a 2015 article, the treatment of minorities under Islamist parties remains an open question, and claims of goodwill may mark different realities. Even the most liberal exponents of the Muslim Brotherhood have taken special care never to describe their Syria as secular, but only civil, with the broader explicit goal of an Islamic state still affirmed. It is not surprising, therefore, that most Christians have supported the government that has protected their social and religious freedoms. Christian leaders in Syria have been heavily criticized for doing so, but their position is not just a pragmatic necessity. It is rooted in historical legal traditions by which Christian communities have been able to wield positive influence for their communities. That's sort of setting a scene. I'm going to move now to Eastern Christian approaches to Christian-Muslim dialogue in Syria. In the matter of Christian-Muslim relations, Western churches and governments have neglected the importance of the Eastern ecclesial Antiochian paradigm. Here I briefly consider the work of 3 theologians who have been influential participants in contemporary religious and political discourse in Syria and Lebanon. They are George Coder, who was born in 1923, just still alive, Eastern Orthodox Metropolitan Mount Lebanon, he was, Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Ignatius Ephraim, currently the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch, born in 1965, and Antoine Aldo, Chaldean Bishop of Aleppo. born 1946. I also briefly consider the Protestant influence on Middle Eastern interreligious dynamics. The Eastern ecclesial paradigm is important both because it represents 12% of the global Christian population and because it includes Greek, Byzantine, Syriac, and Latin traditions. This plurality is inherent in society and represents a dynamic of living dialogue within the Arab context that has continued in Eastern Christianity from the Church Fathers to the present day. It therefore has enormous potential to inform modern interreligious discourse. Western understanding of the Christian-Muslim dynamic is indebted to the work of Louis Massignon, 1883 to 1962, a Melkite priest who significantly raised the profile of Christian-Muslim dialogue in the Catholic Church and is believed to have significantly influenced the Vatican II document Nostra Aetate. His influence, however, went far beyond Catholicism. He studied with the Shiite scholar Ali Shariati, whose thought played a role in the religious revival in Iran in 1979. Massignon regarded Abraham as the model of sacred hospitality. Through mystical engagement, Massignon understood Islam as a mediator of grace. He believed that both commitment to the other, he believed that both Christian and Muslim responses to suffering are rooted in hospitality, mutual compassion, and commitment to the other, the stranger. He believed that the Syriac Catholic rite could help explain Islamic thought to the West, and that the healing of divisions between Eastern and Western Christians and of the antagonism between Islam and Christianity could flow from a spiritual experience of God, lived by believers, open to dialogical encounter with the other. In other words, through this sacred hospitality, we can encounter the divine in the other. We mustn't forget that monasticism was born in the Arab world and influenced early Islamic theological thinking, and this has been a vehicle of this encounter ever since. The monasteries have played and continue to play, increasingly have played an important part in this encounter. A further influential writer who stresses the importance of the Antiochian paradigm in Christian-Muslim relations is the French Orthodox lay theologian Olivier Clément. For Clément, relationality, quote, is part of the mystery of God and constitutes the vocation of the created being. Clément cites Massignon and Coder as illustrating the unique Eastern Christian contribution to the Christian-Muslim dynamic. However, he warns of two faces of Islam, which Christianity needs to be aware of when engaging in dialogue. These, he says, are represented by the respective writings of Muhammad Talbi, who regards pluralism as an essential characteristic of all religions, and Tariq Ramadan, who we know quite well here in the West, who regards the West as hostile to Islam and desires an Islamization of the West. As Hugh Donovan writes, Talbi engages and takes interest in European thought and Christianity, whereas for Ramadan, the West is a space for Islam to reassert its old dominance. Eastern Christians have engaged with Islam for centuries in a way that Western Christians have not. It was only in the 20th century and following Vatican II that the importance of this interreligious dynamic and Eastern Christianity's contribution to it was recognized. For this reason, John Paul II, deeply aware of the divide between Western and Eastern Christianity, declared that the Universal Church, quote, needs to learn to breathe with two lungs. But more than this, given the complex dynamics within Islam as it grapples with the rise of political Islamism, increased Sunni-Shia tensions, and how it engages with the modern world, the ongoing presence of and engagement with Christianity presents an opportunity for dialogue and discernment, especially for strengthening the political, communal, and religious space in which the multiple communities can continue to coexist and flourish. And Syria is central to this Eastern Christian dynamic. Home to each of the three Antiochian patriarchates, it has also become home to many Assyrian Christians and a major center for the Armenian community following the Armenian genocide in 1915. As a result of the Iraq War and the Syrian conflict, many Christians have emigrated, but the nature and resilience of Eastern Christianity in Syria remains strong, and its historic and contemporary ecclesial and theological contribution to interreligious relations makes it potentially a vital resource for the future. So going to George Cotter, the Eastern Orthodox are the most numerous denomination in the region, and their contribution to Christian-Muslim relations is important. Rooted in the Byzantine tradition and enjoying foreign protection and support, the Eastern Orthodox Church was deeply impacted by the Ottoman Empire and the imposition of the millet system, which allowed a flourishing of the Christian communities. Following the collapse of the Ottoman state, however, the Eastern Orthodox had to renegotiate their status in a context that was overwhelmingly Muslim. This involved celebrating and affirming their indigenous Arab identity and promoting secular nationalism in order to secure equal status for Muslims. The Eastern Orthodox community is more numerous in Syria than in Lebanon. They have, quote, walked a thin line between Arab-Syrian nationalism and Lebanon's uniqueness as a place where East and West could meet on an equal footing. They have sought to indigenize their theology within the culture of the Arab world in order, but the rise of political Islam and Islamic extremism have caused a reassessment for some of that identity. Of all contemporary Eastern theological experts in the Christian-Muslim relations, perhaps the most influential has been George Cotter, the Eastern Orthodox Metropolitan of Mount Lebanon until a few years ago. In his published articles, he, quotes, rekindles and reawakens the Christian theological flames of the early centuries that present the primordial and simple Christian message of divine love. His writings emerge from the patristic heritage and the mystical theology of the Eastern Church. This theology is rooted in an understanding of the other that speaks to the Christian-Muslim dynamic. In the 1940s, Cotter was instrumental in the renaissance of the Orthodox Church in Lebanon. He set up educational centers which formed a new generation of clergy and religious leaders. It also led to a resurgence in monasticism and the establishment of new centers of theological study, such as Balamand University in Lebanon, a leading institution now in the Middle East. Cotter was born in Tripoli, Lebanon in 1923. His youth was spent in an Islamic quarter of the city, an experience that symbolized for him the coming out of Christian communities into full participation in the life of their communities. Cotter believed that Christians should be a part of the Islamic world with equal rights and that they should fully participate in the life of their compatriots. The basis of Cotter's apophatic theology, following Gregory of Nyssa and Dionysius the Areopagite and Maximus the Confessor, is the impossibility of describing the essence of God, which remains an incomprehensible mystery. In one of his most influential articles, Cotter writes, "If obedience to the Master means following him wherever we find traces of his presence, we have an obligation to investigate the authentic spiritual life of non-Christians. Thus, starting with the mystery of God as creator, the mystery of God in Christ, and as God as spirit, Cotter explores the implications for God's and our relationship with all humanity, which allows for the possibility of the hiddenness of Christ within other faiths, here echoing, of course, Karl Rahner's transcendental theology. Cotter maintains that the only name given to God is love, and if so, then it is love that expresses the divine work in Christ and in relation to the other. Love, he states, is the cradle of faith. For him, echoing the early fathers of the East, faith, spiritual experience, and transformation take priority over reason." At the core of Cotter's theology lies what he calls the economy of the spirit. It is this economy of the spirit which makes the presence of Christ possible and the living of authentic spiritual lives possible for all human beings, regardless of any religious restrictions. He writes, "The Spirit operates and applies his energies in accordance with his own economy, and we could, from this angle, regard the non-Christian religions as points where his inspiration is at work. If that is so, then Christ cannot be owned by some people and not by others, and we have a duty to discern Christ in others." Cotter criticizes Western theology for its exclusive dogmatism and believes Eastern Christianity's mystical approach to theology represents a truer reflection of Christian theology and spirituality. The pervasiveness of Western thought and civilization, he believes, is spiritually destructive, since the West tends, quote, to consider man as the center of the universe. By contrast, Eastern spirituality, with its spirituality of detachment and pursuit of truth, is the place where the spiritual life can, quote, become incarnate in history as a movement, ready to be transmitted by utilizing the instruments of knowledge, even politics itself, in the service of humanity. Cotter believes that Eastern culture and spirituality have the capacity to help Europe to transcend itself and to be spiritually renewed in the service of humanity. He adds that only within a secularized state can Christianity coexist with other religions. For only under civil rule, deprived of all exclusivist inclination, can sectarian prejudice be overcome. Cotter's theology and writings have both theological and political relevance for Christianity's engagements in the Middle East. He has often been critical of the Orthodox Church's willingness to step back from political engagement and decision-making processes. Rather, he believes faith communities should work together for the freedom, equality, and needs of all people. This approach, rooted in the riches of the Eastern patristic theology, and in, quote, a theological, philosophical language that is neither alien nor exclusive to any of the followers of the two religions, clearly has continuing relevance in the region and could continue to be helpful for Christian-Muslim relations in post-conflict Syria. In December 2017, I had the privilege of meeting with Bishop Cotter at his home in Lebanon. He was deeply reflective and not optimistic about the current prospects for the development of interreligious relations dialogue. Echoing others with whom I've spoken, he was disappointed at the lack of depth in Christian-Muslim dialogue in recent years. One of the reasons he suggests is that, quote, contemporary Islam is complete in itself. All contemporary Islamic thoughts are justifications of the truth of Islam. Additionally, many Muslims feel deeply and profoundly that the West is orientated against them. Speaking from decades of engagement with and reflection on the subject, Cotter continued with a message that I believe is both challenging and has lasting relevance. We as Christians are not courageous enough to face this reality. We're not hopeful enough to see that sometime Islam could evolve in a way that could make itself more engaged in human destiny and the suffering of humanity. I feel that Christians too are still rooted in hierarchies, priesthood, and the old allegiances of theology. We lack a real theology of engagement with the world. The situation is very difficult. Many Muslims and many Christians forget that God is not thought, God is love. It is our duty as Christians to reveal the love of God in our dealings with others and with the world. That is what we can teach our Muslim friends. If we look back at the Christians in the first century, we can rediscover something of our faith. They were not concerned with politics. They were mixed with the population, keeping the faith. They lived the gospel, be witnesses of the gospel in our daily lives. This is the way forward. Presented with the level of sectarian violence unleashed during the Syrian and Iraq conflicts, his theology looks even more challenging and some may say unrealistic, especially as many Christian communities wish to strengthen their sense of Christian identity. And yet the diversity that Cotter's theology embraces makes his contribution of lasting relevance to the religious landscape in the region. I turn now to Bishop Antoine Odo, the Chaldean Bishop of Aleppo. The Chaldean Church, which is of Syriac culture and tradition in full communion in Rome, emerged from the Church of the East to the East due to a schism in 1552 and continues to use the Syriac liturgy. Relations between the See of Rome and the churches of the East have improved considerably since Vatican II. The relations between the Chaldean Church and the Assyrian Church remain strained. The Chaldean Church, whilst being Catholic, remains a truly indigenous and Eastern Christian expression of the Church in Syria. Through Audo, the Syriac culture in this expression, the Antiochian paradigm, is in dialogue with the Arabic culture and Islamic religion. Born in Aleppo in 1946, Audo became Jesuit in 1969, ordained priest in 1979, studied in Damascus, Paris, and Rome, and held teaching posts in Beirut and in Lebanon. He reflects a common concern for both Christians and Muslims in the region, and is very concerned in his work to identify the relation between religious tradition and plurality of the plurality of religious expression as a continuing element of Christianity and the Islamic tradition. Like Cotter, Audo's theology and spirituality is deeply rooted in the patristic tradition. Audo reminds us that Eastern spirituality embraces a variety of traditions emerging from the schools of Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople, and includes Armenian, Coptic, and Syriac traditions. Quoting Isaac of Nineveh, a great 7th century Eastern mystic, he concludes, "Love is the source of all that is good. Whoever has found love will eat and drink Christ." Referring to John of Dalyatha, an 8th century mystic living in the area currently bordering Iraq and Turkey, Audo posits the view that because of its Semitic roots, Eastern spirituality is, quote, more poetic and symbolic than philosophical and rational. Its result is a desire to be united in God and his will, which is the vocation of all Christians. In another article, exploring Eastern Christian identity and making connections between Eastern mysticism and modernity, Audo compares two visionary and prophetic spiritual figures, Monsignor Edelby, who died in 1995, and Father Afif Oserene, who died in 1988. Both became Eastern Christians, one of whom was a convert from Shia Islam. From these two figures, Audo draws the conclusion that Christians are called to witness in a Muslim environment through their prayer life and an attitude of adoration. Audo writes, dialogue between reason and faith, communion respecting difference, a flight from violence in order to affirm trust in oneself and in others, these are demands which challenge our intellect as Christians and Muslims in search of peace and justice. Audo acknowledges that this dialogue is not easy. In an interview in December 2016, he stated to me, Christians accept plurality in Syria. We cannot reflect on our shared existence in Syria without dialogue, but this is often more difficult for Islam, which finds it difficult to enter into dialogue at a critical and historical level, and often dialogue will consist simply of affirmative speech. Islam in the Middle East cannot get away from the struggle with modernity and faces a problem with the idea of secularism, as this attacks something very deep within Muslim thought. But there is a difference between public and private speech, since many Muslims recognize that without Christians, Syria will lose both its quality of life and its unique identity. He continues, at the start of the conflict, militants tried to pit Muslims against Christians, but they failed. Our country has a rich culture and history to which Syrians are loyal, regardless of religion. Syria is more than one man. This is not well understood in the West. It is important that we continue to represent Arab Christianity, to show the Muslim and Arab world that there are Christians with whom they can have a dialogue. This comment, by the way, about the loss of Christians being a huge loss to Syrian society is one that has been made numerous times to me, not only by Christians in Syria, but by Muslims of all communities, including many Sunni Muslims. They've said, you know, the current situation and the threat of the militant Islamists to Christianity in Syria is a dire threat to the whole status of Syria itself. In summary, Audo affirms the importance of the identity of Eastern Christians. This identity, rooted in the Middle Eastern world, is communitarian in spirit, hospitable, and exists within the Muslim world, but too often becomes inward and distrustful of others. He states that Christians should engage politically, socially, and culturally, both with Christians and Muslims, and that the interreligious dialogue encounter that takes place daily should develop into deeper dialogue that is lived out and respectful of the other. Notwithstanding the risk of a tendency to activism in this approach, the spiritual traditions of the East have the capacity to inspire and deepen spiritual engagement and understanding with Islam. Audo continues, a rereading of the contribution of Eastern Christians to the development of Arab and Muslim civilization allows us to envisage ways of openness, trust, and conversion. Most importantly, Eastern Christians have, quote, opened up spaces within the fabric of Muslim Arab culture, spaces of freedom and communication between faith and reason, and are uniquely placed in a context where Arab Muslims feel threatened in the face of modernity and globalization to enable dialogue with Muslims. Finally, Audo writes, true Islam must understand that it will not be able to modernize itself without there being peace with Christians. This road to peace will lead it to be liberated from all its complexes of fear of the other. The vocation of Eastern Christians is therefore to become a bridge, or better, a model of communion between the Christian West and the Muslim world. I now go quickly to Ignatius Afrem, the current Syriac Orthodox Patriarch. The Syriac Orthodox Church is part of the Oriental Orthodox family of churches, which were isolated from Roman and Byzantine Christianity following the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The Syriac Orthodox Church has a long and rich history and liturgical tradition. Situated originally in Antioch, the Patriarchate was forced to move by persecution from Mardin in Turkey to Homs in 1933 and then to Damascus in 1959. In 1995, it was reported that there were 89,000 Syrian Orthodox in Syria, representing about 10% of the Christian population. Due to political instability and religious persecutions, its numbers have declined drastically in the Middle East, but grown significantly elsewhere, particularly in Europe, Lebanon, and America. Patriarch Ephraim was born in Qamishli in Syria and studied in Lebanon, Ireland, and Egypt. Amidst the conflict, the Syriac Orthodox presence in Syria has remained influential, though numbers have drastically declined. The patriarchal headquarters at Maretz Naya, on the picture on the left there, continues to train clergy from all over the world, and reflecting the church's emphasis on education, a new university was opened there in 2018. Additionally, the charitable work of the church through the St. Ephraim Patriarchal Development Committee is benefiting tens of thousands of people of all communities across Syria. I stress again the work of the Christian churches, the humanitarian work of the Christian churches in Syria, notwithstanding the devastating impact of sanctions, is absolutely phenomenal and is benefiting tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Patriarch Ephraim's representative role as religious leader, both nationally and internationally, is significant. And in this role, his speeches offer a window into a Syrian Christian response to the contemporary context and to Christian-Muslim relations. Both Christians and Muslims in Syria often stress in conversation the importance of the Christian presence. In a lecture in 2015 entitled "Do Muslims Need Christians in the Middle East?", Patriarch Ephraim said, "I believe that Muslims and Christians need to challenge themselves to live in a pluralistic and multi-religious society where they can affirm their religious identity without being afraid of the other. Living together should be conceived by Muslims and Christians alike as a divine vision and plan. We Christians believe that God has placed us in the region with the mission of spreading love, tolerance, and enlightenment." The Syrian community has, of course, experienced extreme persecutions. During the Saifa massacres of 1915, it's estimated that over 500,000 Syriacs were murdered. And recent massacres by ISIS and Islamists and other groups of Syriac Christians in Iraq and Syria, as well, of course, of Muslims, have reignited memory of this history. The kidnap on 22nd of April 2013 of two Aleppo archbishops, Syriac Orthodox Archbishop Gregorius Ibrahim and Eastern Orthodox Archbishop Paul Yazigi, pictured on the bottom left there, has had a profound impact on the Christian communities. In a response to the increased rise in sectarianism both in Syria and across the Middle East, Patriarch Ephraim says, "Fanaticism and religious extremism should not be allowed to spread in the region. It should be made known to all that Christians will not abandon their faith or alter their way of living because of the ideology of individuals and groups to whom moderation is foreign and tolerance is alien. We will continue to live in peace with the millions of peace-loving Muslims, Jews, and other religious groups in the Middle East. As Christians, our mission is to spread love, peace, and harmony in the world." Patriarch Ephraim has been a strong critic of Western support for militant groups. Speaking at the launch of a report on religious freedom at the House of Commons on 24th of November 2016, he said, "It's very important to identify who our persecutor is. The report suggests that the persecution of Christians in Syria is done by both state and non-state groups alike. We do not see it as such. The Syrian government has always been for Christians. In Syria, violence against Christians is inflicted by the terrorist groups, including ISIS and on Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, who desire to wipe us out of Syria. In Syria, all discrimination and persecution that the Christians are currently suffering from are carried out by the terrorist groups, some of which are internationally recognized as moderate opposition." Along with most Christian leaders in the region, Patriarch Ephraim affirms diversity and plurality as integral to Middle Eastern society. Like other religious leaders, Patriarch Ephraim believes that religious leaders continue to have an important role to play in the region. At an international conference in Athens in 2017, Patriarch Ephraim identified 5 areas of common concern, which he said require common action and firm commitment by religious leaders. These are protecting life, affirming diversity, rejecting extremism, overcoming violence, and striving for peace with justice. At a conference for World Mission In Tanzania in 2018, Patriarch Ephraim summarized his position as follows: "Our presence is a necessity, not only for Christianity to continue in the land where it was born, but also for the people of the area. Christians have always been an essential element of reconciliation and bridge building among different ethnic and religious components in the region. We need to bring hope to our people that they still have a future in their homeland by attending to their needs, both in terms of security and financial help. All churches in Syria have been actively engaged in relief efforts, as well as development projects to create job opportunities for our people. Interreligious dialogue on the academic level is not sufficient, alone is not sufficient. We need to initiate joint activities such as workshops, seminars, and camps among Muslim and Christian young people. We need the support of our brothers and sisters around the world in two main areas in terms of advocacy and development. Christians can only survive under secular governments where they could be treated based on the principle of citizenship with equal rights and obligations." And 2 weeks after speaking those words, a group of which I was a part met with him in Damascus, and he said, "Your presence here is an indication of your love for us and your desire to seek the truth. God loves all people, and our duty as Syrian Christians is to express that desire in our country. Syrian Christians have always been children of martyrdom. We are a church of martyrs. We have never been an established or state church, but we have faith and perseverance, and we will continue to be witnesses of God's love and presence in this place, whatever it costs us. We need the church worldwide to help enable the local church to fulfill that mission in this place. A brief word on the Protestant and Evangelical churches, and this will be brief. The Protestant churches are numerically small in Syria and in the region, but their influence through educational, health, and social welfare institutions is significant. The first Protestant congregation in the Middle East was formed in Beirut in 1827. In the Middle East, Protestant churches, including the Anglican, Lutheran, and Presbyterian denominations, are all titled Evangelical. However, the mainstream Protestant churches are to be distinguished from the independent evangelical groups that have established new independent evangelical churches, some of which sought to convert non-Christians and members of the indigenous Eastern churches to their fold. This has been a source of tension not only amongst Protestant denominations, but also between Protestant and Eastern churches, particularly as Eastern churches tend not to distinguish between different Protestant denominations. Although the roots of Protestant churches lie in 19th century missionary activity, the Protestant churches are indigenous Arab communities who use Arabic for liturgy and worship. Their Western origin can be a challenge for relations with Eastern churches. In recent years, there's been a struggle for identity for Arab Protestant Christians. Dr. George Sabra, principal of the Nero School of Theology in Beirut, distinguishes two positions for Eastern Christians as being either Arab Christian or Eastern Christian. The first underlines the sense of self-identity with Arab culture, history, and Islamic civilization, whilst the second does not limit Middle Eastern Christianity to an Arab identity, but underlines, quote, a critical distance from Islam and Islamic culture and tradition. And these are two paradigms which are increasingly getting, there's a tension between. The rise of Islamism has challenged the Arab Christian position. Sabra writes, "The Islamist fundamentalist resurgence is like a huge wave that has engulfed the results of the old dialogue and set the clock back many years. The two ways of Christian self-identification are both present, of course, in Syria, but the two outlooks are not mutually exclusive and remain part of the dilemma of being Christian in the Muslim context." And a few conclusions before we enter into discussion. This paper is very briefly, all too briefly, examined the encounter between Christianity and Islam in Syria and considered just a few Eastern theological contributions to that discourse. And I do cover much more in depth others in my book and go into it in more depth. It remains to summarize a few conclusions. The preservation and improvement of interreligious relationships is widely desired, but given the level of suffering and destruction experienced within Syria, the impact of extreme Islamist ideology on interreligious relations and the fragmentation of society, priority has been given to the humanitarian response. Given the rise in militant Islam, Arab religious identity, both Christian and Muslim, is now being contested and requires renewed discourse. A rereading of the Christian contribution to the development of Arab and Muslim civilization will help understanding of the roots of Christianity. The Orthodox and Oriental churches, the monastic movement, the spirituality of the desert, and patristic theology all offer a key to reconnecting with the spirituality and culture within which early Christianity engaged with Islam, and to challenging the violent ideology that characterizes much of the militant Syrian opposition. Similarly, recognition of plurality in Arab religion and culture and Eastern Christianity's incapacity to engage with it offers potential for grappling with the communal complexities of the post-conflict context in Syria. I want to stress again, the Islamic context in Syria is also plural. It is not monolithic at all by any means, and that needs to be recognized. Understanding those complexities will be essential to the dialogue, which will be a necessary part of healing and establishing stability in Syrian society. Those religious dynamics are far too recognized within discourse and political imagining of the current situation. Amongst many Syrians, there is a fear that the rise of Islamism, even if defeated, might lie dormant in loyal adherence until the next opportunity arises to assert itself. I've heard that many times from Christians. We're worried that the next time militant Islam emerges, the next opportunity arises, we will be attacked again. This fear alone causes continued immigration. Christian leaders in Syria have often been criticized for siding with the Syrian government. Such a view underestimates the influence of the historic role of religious leadership since Ottoman times, and inherent in Arab culture, and the social, cultural, and religious complexity of the contemporary context in which religious leaders play an important representative and intermediary role, often acting as critical voices in politics and religion. Religious leaders have played an important leadership and reconciliatory role during the conflict and continue to do so. Next, the Christian presence in Syria, though seriously weakened, remains a dynamic, diverse, influential, and vital part of Syrian society. Its engagement at all levels of society and with all communities represents a positive foundation for learning from the conflict and helping the country restore trust in society, reconcile fractured communities, overcome sectarian fears, and encourage and nurture frameworks for political dialogue. Plurality and difference define Syria. What's utterly shocking, I think, in current discourse, religious discourse, Western religious discourse, political discourse, media discourse, is the complete ignoring of the religious leaders in Syria, actually. It's almost complete ignoring them. This plurality represents both a challenge and a resource for the future. Whatever the future holds, it's hoped that the political space that emerges will be a dialogical one, which the secular and diverse religious mosaic of Syrian society can peacefully cohabit. Next, the future role and identity of Islam in Syrian society and its relationship with modern statehood will be crucial to the stability of a society that emerges in the years to come. The extent to which contemporary expressions of Sunni Islam are able to sustain the space in which religious pluralism and freedom of religious practice are maintained will determine future levels of communal trust and the survival of religious plurality in Syria. This is why so many Syrians of all communities, including many Sunnis, are opposed to the militant opposition because they fear a Sunni takeover that will establish a Sunni state, an Islamic state in Syria that will do away with the plurality. That's a fact. Study of these issues within Islam are essential to assisting a secure, plural religious future. Next, the breadth of the Christian presence distinguishes Christianity in Syria. From my years, decades of engaging with the Middle East, I would say that Syria is almost the most plural Christian country in the region. You know, its presence is incredibly diverse. And its shared culture and experience of the Eastern churches makes them a significant resource for the worldwide church in discerning and developing future models of Christian-Muslim engagement, not just in the Middle East, but actually around the world. The Antahian paradigm, rooted in cultural, theological, and historical frameworks familiar to both Islam and Christianity, and holding an important position within the wider ecclesial and political context, has been neglected by the worldwide church for far too long. The Antiochian patristic theological and spiritual approaches to interreligious dynamics, given contemporary voice by modern theologians and church leaders, have a potentially important role to play in interreligious dynamics in Syria and the wider region. And my last paragraph. Syria has been through one of the most violent conflicts the world has seen in recent decades, and the interreligious dynamic has survived. Until now, the interreligious context in Syria has been insufficiently understood and understudied. In seeking a clearer understanding of that dynamic, and in a reframing of Eastern Christianity's ecclesial, theological, and spiritual traditions, lies the potential for informing new frameworks of religious and political engagement, a sustained embrace of plurality, and a significant contribution towards a lasting peace, however difficult a journey that might be. And I just want to share a last quote from Archbishop Jean-Bart of Aleppo. So much has been misrepresented in Syria, or underrepresented, and the voices of the Syrians within government-held areas of Syria has been really underrepresented in discourse, media, political, religious. And John Barr said to me, it's a duty of every Christian to find out the truth. It's a huge injustice to judge others until you know the truth. We need our Christian brothers and sisters in the West to learn the truth and help us to stay, not to leave. After all the suffering, we are working hard with our Muslim brothers and sisters to open hearts and minds to each other. And throughout my many visits to Syria, through the course of the conflict, that is a fact and a truth that I have found both to be true and deeply humbling, and something that we really should be listening to. I hope this helps to help that discourse. Thank you very much.